Joining me now to talk more about this global water crisis in Beijing, we're joined by Lijing Zhong, a senior associate at the World Resources Institute, and a show on the water crisis, of course, wouldn't be complete if we didn't have someone from California, which is suffering from one of the state's worst droughts in the past century, and that is Chevany Rivas. She is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at water.org, and she's coming to us from Berkeley, California. With us here in the studio is David Mickle. David is the Director of Environmental Security at the Stimson Center. We just saw this piece, David, and I'll start with you from Mei Li, kind of looking at the overall economic implications of this drought in California. Give us a scene setter. Why is California struggling so much with the drought right now?
Well, the scope of the drought is historic. California measures its water situation by water year, which runs from October to September. And this past water year was the third driest in 119 years. Reservoir levels are down to about 1/3 of capacity, which is about 50% of their average levels. And the economic consequences are stretching across the state. Agriculture, a $48 billion industry, will see about $2 billion in losses because of inadequate water supplies, but also hydroelectricity is affected. California gets 20% of its power from hydro, and when there's less water in the rivers, there's less water to turn the turbines, and it's costing Californians about $1.4 billion to buy natural gas and other fuels to generate more power.
And Chevany, he just gave us an overview. You live there in California. I mean, it must be the talk of the state. I mean, and obviously everybody's feeling the effects of it, aren't they?
Sure. Absolutely. Being here in California, it's sort of like talking about the weather, frankly. And in our work at water.org, we're really focused on international access to safe drinking water. And so it's really interesting for me in the work that we do in developing countries where, frankly, we've been working on access to safe drinking water for decades, where 1 in 9 people actually don't have access to safe drinking water. So it's fascinating to locally, at a state level and even at a national level, be really turning up the dialogue on that very issue here at home for the first time in my career.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to draw Lijing Zhong into the conversation because, of course, China is home to nearly 20% of the world's population and yet has access to just about 6% of the water's fresh water. So this is a big issue there. Drought, also a problem in China from time to time. Pollution in the water as well can be an issue. Talk to me about how serious the water crisis is there in China.
I think the water crisis is very, very serious in China. Firstly, I think that we know that China is a water scarcity country, and the water resources per capita is very, very low, and we only have about, I think, less than 1/4 of the global average for the water resources per capita. And at the same time, we know that China is very big, and all the water conditions across the country is very different. So my organization, World Resources Institute, is also working on a global water risk mapping, and we found that in China, about 1/3 the areas are facing very high water stress or the extreme highly water stress there. At the same time, China is also facing the pollution challenges and make the available water resources much challengeable. And we also, just now you mentioned about the recent drought in California, but in fact in China, even in some areas which was sufficient in water resources, now it's also facing the drought challenges. For example, the southwest of China is also facing serious the drought challenge there. So you can see that the water crisis is everywhere here, so it's a really important issue now.
It's everywhere here. You just heard her say that. And it's not just everywhere here in China. It's not just everywhere here in California, as Chevany definitely knows. It seems to be everywhere. We're seeing droughts, major issues out there. Why?
Well, no, that's absolutely right. We're seeing droughts not only in California, but in Texas. We saw much in the news recently about drought in Sao Paulo, a city of more than 20 million people, where reservoir levels were down to 5% of average and was impacting the whole Brazilian economy, increasing inflation, lowering GDP. There are a number of pressures on the world's water resources today. Growing population. Population has about quadrupled in the past 100 years, but water demand has gone up sevenfold. Growing economies, richer countries, people can afford new products, new diets, washing machines, washers and dryers, so there's rising demand. And then there's also the continuing impacts of climate change. That's was changing precipitation patterns, the timing and the location of rainfall. So there's increasing stress on water resources around the world, but there's also inefficient management in many places. We were talking a minute ago about the impact of the drought in California on agriculture in that state. But some of the most intensive agriculture in the world, the largest area of irrigation in the world, Pakistan and India. But in a country like Pakistan, only about 50% of the water that's withdrawn from rivers to irrigate their crops actually makes it to the farmers' fields. It's lost through leaky canals or evaporates into thin air. So we can do better.
Chevany, I saw you nodding your head and smiling. This is right up your alley. These are things you must see all the time.
Yeah, it is, Mike, and I really appreciate David's comments about just use, right, and that we can do better. I think that when we think about our work and in advocating for the poor to have very basic access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation, you think about we're really just trying to level the playing field. In fact, the world's poor pay the most for just basic access to drinking water, as I mentioned. These are basic services that I think we really take for granted in the West and in more developed countries, and I think you know, your guest from China here it would be fascinating to understand too, just sort of the equity in terms of access to drinking water in a place like China, where you have enormous resources, but you just have enormous usage as well. In places as you mentioned, you know, in India, Southeast Asia, in East Africa, or places where we at water.org work to, as I said, really level that playing field so that people at least are getting the same amount and the same access. I think we can do better. I think industrial and agricultural use of water, as your guest mentioned, are enormous drains in terms of water resources. But in terms of just basic human, human access, human consumption, the human right to water is pretty fundamental. And I think that as a global community, we can get there in our lifetime to ensure that everyone has equal access. And then, we have these larger looming issues that we really need to tackle. But first and foremost, I think we have the moral responsibility and the opportunity to ensure that there is no longer a child under 5 who is succumbing from a waterborne illness, which is entirely preventable, which happens once a minute. A child under 5 will succumb to a preventable illness, and it's just not right. And we can do better than that. No,
those are staggering statistics. And Li Jinzhong, she pointed out China, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about this, because China has been amazing as an economic juggernaut, but at some point you have to think perhaps water is going to impact the economy. Certainly when you think about agriculture, some of the different issues, manufacturing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, of course, China has achieved a very amazing achievement in economic growth. But to be honest, I think that now I think that the government has paid much more attention on the water issue, but now China is facing a big challenge for the urbanization, for the industrialization, also how to feed the 20% population of the world. So everything needs water, and unfortunately, the water pie, the total available water resources, it's not increasing together with the increasing demand. So now how to balance the water supply, how to fill in the gap between the water supply and the water demand is a very big challenge for China's economic development.
Well, you just mentioned two very important words, demand and challenge, and we're going to talk about both of those as we continue our conversation next. Will water become the new oil? That's coming up. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.